All right, as always, we're going to start with the ABCs of salvation because the most important thing is that people know Jesus personally. Salvation is not about how good you are, about doing everything right. It's about the finished work of Jesus Christ. And so first, we have to admit that we are a sinner, that it's not about how good we are, but it's about how good God is and the finished work of Jesus on the cross. And because everybody has sinned, everyone has fallen short of the glory of God. And then we believe on Jesus. We're putting our trust in Jesus for our salvation, believing that Jesus is God, that he was able to save us, and putting our trust in him and his finished work on the cross for our salvation. And so we are confessing that it's no longer about us, but now we are following Christ. We are confessing that, and we believe in our heart that Jesus is Lord, confess with our mouth, and we are saved. And so it's important to know Jesus as your Savior, have a personal relationship with him. It's not about how much you know, it's about who you know. And so tonight we're going to look at God's sabbatical cycles. We're going to look at the Year of Jubilee, but in order to really understand the Year of Jubilee, we have to back up and start at the Sabbath and understand the weekly Sabbath, the yearly Sabbath, and then the Jubilee. And so here, Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, is about understanding and entering into God's rest. So God has provided a rest for all of us. And all we need to do is enter into that rest by trusting in Jesus and the finished work of what he did. Now, God in the Old Testament, he set up between Israel, he set up the weekly Sabbath. And this is a weekly holiday celebrating the creation, that God created everything, that God is the origination of everything, and that it's also pointing to the millennial reign. So it's the beginning and the end, a weekly celebration, a weekly holiday of that. So we see here in Exodus, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, or your son or your daughter or your male servant or female servant or your livestock or sojourner who is within your gates. So there's no working. 6 days you have to work. The seventh day, that is when you rest. When you cease from your striving, you cease from your manipulation, you cease from you controlling, and you rest in God and you spend time with him and you spend time with your family. And so that's the pattern that God wanted to set up. He says, for 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that's in them. And he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and he made it holy. Making it holy, he set it apart. You know, God calls every day according to his number. He didn't say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. God says first day, second day, third day, all the way up to the seventh day, which is the Sabbath day. And it's a special, it's called Sabbath. And that is a resting time. It's a special set apart holy day. So Sabbath is a blessing, but it's also a sign. You know, it's a sign of creation. But it's also a sign looking ahead to the end of all things. And Sabbath is a sign specifically to the Israel people, the Hebrew people. We are blessed by it. God created our bodies with Sabbath in mind, you know, so it's good for us to rest. It's good for us to get that. But the lesson that he's teaching is specifically assigned to Israel. So it's assigned to Israel. So moreover, I gave them my Sabbaths. This is, of course, God speaking in Ezekiel, as a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. So Sabbath is all about sanctification. It's about setting apart for holy, the difference between common and holy. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel, that in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. And so we see here Sabbath, that every week, the seventh day is that Sabbath day, that day that's set apart. So the purpose for Sabbath is to teach us to rest from our work. It's to teach man that we're not in control. So to remind man, and I think this is such an important thing to remind our kids, that God created. You know, the enemy tries to attack that. The enemy tries to attack creation. But it's a weekly reminder that God created everything in 6 days. He rested on the seventh day. And it's a weekly reminder that our future is limited too. We only have so much time where man is working out on earth, where man is, you know, not to say that man really is in charge right now, but that we are working out things right now. There's only 6 days to labor. The seventh day is the day of resting in God. And so we're looking forward to the 7,000 year, which is the millennial reign of Christ. And man has been working, man has been manipulating, man has been doing all these things for nearly 6,000 years. And so we're nearing the millennium. We're nearing that 7th millennium. And so for more on that too, you can look at the Sabbath rest video on YouTube. You can look at my Sabbath rest video, and it really goes through each millennium and how it ties to the weekly Sabbath. Day 1 ties to the first millennium, day 2 ties to the second millennium, and so on. So it's very interesting to see that here. But you see, the purpose of Sabbath is to remind man that it's not about us, it's about God. He created everything, and he's going to close it all in his perfect timing. This man seems to forget that. And also to teach us that there are patterns. God is a God of patterns, and he created us to be looking for patterns. He created us to look for numbers. He created us to look for order. You know, and you can see that in little children. If children don't have an order and a plan, and they don't kind of know what's coming and have a pattern that they're used to, they get frustrated. And the same is true for us. If we don't have we fall into patterns naturally. And when we don't have those patterns to lean on, we can get frustrated. We can get, you know, we can even get depressed from that. So God created us to look for patterns, and he has planted patterns that lead to him all throughout his word. And so he's got these patterns of the Sabbath of the week, Sabbath years, Sabbath cycles. And so we look at the harvest, we look at the 7 feasts of the Lord, and all of these are teaching us to trust God, teaching us to rely on him, to expect him to be trustworthy, and to expect him to do something, to be looking for him and trusting in that we can trust him, these patterns, so we can rely on him and not be frustrated and not be scared by things, so we can learn to anticipate his movement. So like the weekly Sabbath, there is a Shemitah. So I don't know if you guys have heard of Shemitah before, but it is the 7-year sabbatical cycle of the land. And so this is specific, especially to Israel, but we can glean and we can learn from this because God is always wanting to teach his children in all these cycles. So similar to the weekly Sabbath, where you work 6 days and you rest on the 7th day, you were to work the land for 6 years. But the Sabbath year, you're to let it lay fallow. You're to release debts, and you're to let the land rest, and let the animals rest, let the people rest. So here we see in Exodus, for 6 years you are to sow your land and gather it on its produce. But in the 7th, you are to let it rest and let it be uncultivated, so that the needy of your people may eat what remains, The wildlife of the field will eat, and thus your vineyard and your olive grove. And so this is good for nature because it allows the land to replenish and allows the land to rest. It provides for the needy. It provides for the animals. So there's a lot of reasons for why this was. But God, of course, is working on multiple levels as always. So the purpose here, God told Israel to work the land for 6 years, but on the Shemitah, which is the year of release. So Shemitah means the year of release, or the sabbatical. Every 7th year, they were to let the land lay fallow, and they were to release debts. So this next Shemitah, like right now, we're looking at the next Shemitah. We're in the 6th year. We're at the very end of the 6th year of the Shemitah cycle. So come this fall, the Shemitah year begins. September 7th, on Rosh Hashanah, the Shemitah year will begin. And so it's interesting to note that in the 6th year of this cycle, Israel would harvest double, because they can't harvest next year. So, and some places in Israel, they practice this, some places they don't, but more and more they're practicing this because they're trying to be obedient to the scripture. And so biblically, they're not supposed to harvest in the 7th year. So during this year, they would harvest double, and they would make preparation to make sure that they had enough to make it through the year. And God would promise that he would provide double, just like when they were in the wilderness, and that Friday, that 6th day before the Sabbath, he would provide extra manna. So when they went out, they collected twice the manna, because they didn't collect manna on the Sabbath. And so the same kind of principle here, they collect double in that last year before the Shemitah year. So here there's a double harvest, and they're preparing to store up enough to not only provide for themselves, but to provide for their community during the 7th year, and even going into the 8th year, because then they have to, in the 8th year, they have to start planting again. They're waiting for the harvest. And so they're having to store up to get them through. So the purpose of the sabbatical cycle was to learn to trust God for the harvest. They had to completely rely on him. And in Israel, especially, because they're having to rely on God for it to rain at the right time for their harvest, everything. Like when we talked about living water, go back and watch that one on living water. That just blew my mind away. But the early and later rains, and how awesome that was, the way that they were having to rely on God for the harvest and for that for every bit of it. So they're resting. So this allowed for man to rest, for animals to rest, and for the land to rest. And the people learned to prepare for lack when they had plenty. They learned to look ahead and prepare for those times where they wouldn't have. And they also were providing for the poor. They were saving enough to not only care for just themselves, but to care for their community. And so all that was built into this practice of every 7 years, this release. So that brings us to the Jubilee, because we've built up here, there's the weekly Sabbath, there's the every 7 year Sabbath. Well, now there's the every 7 Shemitah Sabbath. So you have every 7 days, and then you have every 7 years, and now you have every 7 is the Jubilee. And so in Leviticus, it lays it out. When you come into the land, so this is specifically tied to the land of Israel. When you come into the land, which I will give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year, there'll be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the Lord, a Sabbath unto the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. And so that's the Shemitah that we just explained. And you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years. So counting 7 of those Shemitahs that it just explained. You're counting 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years. And the time of 7 Sabbaths of years shall be 49 years. So that last Shemitah cycle, the very next year is the Jubilee. So they've got 2 years there where they're letting the land lay fallow. So then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. That's the day of Yom Kippur. That's Yom Kippur, the 10th day of the 7th month. And on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur and Day of Atonement is the same thing, you shall make the trumpet to sound. So we see here, you count 49, you have that Shemitah, and then 50 is the Jubilee. So it's like a super Shemitah. It's everything that a Shemitah is, but then more so. All the land goes back to its original owners. Debts are canceled. It is truly a release. And so every 7 cycles of 7, 49 years, the 50th year is called the Yovel, or the Jubilee. So the word Yovel literally means ram's horn. And it's named because it's that ram's horn that's blown on Yom Kippur to announce the Jubilee. So this is interesting because it's the Jubilee, the year starts on Rosh Hashanah. So that's where, you see this Shemitah year is going to start on September 7th, because that's Rosh Hashanah. Well, on the 17th, 10 days later, is Yom Kippur. And so this isn't a Jubilee year, but if it was a Jubilee year, then that would be when the Jubilee would be sounded with the sound of the trumpet. And so it's very interesting, because that trumpet, that just speaks so much prophetically of calling to assembly, the wake up of the people. It has a lot of prophetic meaning there. So here Leviticus, God is telling them the land shall not be sold permanently. And so that's one of the big purposes of the Jubilee, is that the land couldn't end up years down the road not in the hands of the tribes that God had allotted it to. God gave each tribe an allotment of property in Israel. And we see in Ezekiel, we see in Revelation, that God's intention is for the tribes to be back in the very allotted land that God gave them back in Joshua, from the beginning. He wants them back on their land. And so that was one of the big purposes of the Jubilee, was to make sure that the land went back to its original owners. And so you see here in Leviticus, God says, the land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. This land, the land of Israel, belongs to God. The people of Israel belong to God. And so you see from Genesis, when God called Abraham out, where his seed would become the children of Israel, right from the start, he called Abraham out, and he called Abraham to the land of Israel. It was called Canaan then. But it's been this, the entire Bible can be summed up with God restoring the children of Israel to the land of Israel. And so the purpose when this will actually happen is when Messiah, Jesus, will be ruling from the land of Israel. And so all of this is this trying to get them back in their land, but the land belongs to God and the people belong to God. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the land of your possession, you shall grant redemption of the land. And so here they are redeeming the land, and they are remembering who it belongs to. So, and that's why they couldn't stay there if they didn't keep his commands. He said, the land will spew you out if you don't keep my commands. You can't stay there. So during the Jubilee, the land continues to lay fallow. It's released to its original owners, all debts and all slaves, all servants, all those kinds of arrangements are nullified. So people are allowed to go free. All the debts are canceled. it's a big deal. And that's one reason why Israel wasn't really good at keeping it, because they didn't want to give up everything. And so that was why they got exiled, because they didn't keep the Sabbaths. They didn't keep the Shemitahs. They didn't keep the Jubilees. And so, but what they were doing is they were not keeping this picture, this type and shadow that was always looking to Jesus. This was always about him. And so God takes it very, very important that we keep his types and shadows, and we don't mess up what he's trying to teach us about himself. And so they weren't obedient, and that was the reason why they were sent into exile. So, but the purpose of the Jubilee, although the land and the people, it was to allow the land and the people to rest and to secure the land that belongs to each of the 12 tribes. It was a living picture of forgiveness and restoration. So it was the forgiveness of debts, the forgiveness of bad decisions, that sometimes people would lose their family property because they, it could be a bad decision, or it could just be a famine or something where somebody would lose their land. Everything is forgiven, everything is restored back to where it was supposed to be. So Jubilee has not been kept since the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel, and it wasn't kept very well before then. And one of the reasons for this is that the exile, when the northern kingdom was exiled, that was 10 of the 12 tribes that are just now returning to Israel. But here they're looking at Leviticus 25, and they're saying, well, you can't keep Jubilee if all 12 tribes aren't there to be returned to their land. They didn't know how to reconcile that. And it does make sense, because how do you give the land back to the original owner when the original owner is gone, has been sold out to the ends of the earth, and you don't even know where those tribes are anymore. Now we see the tribes coming back, and they can, through DNA testing and all kinds of things, they can determine who these tribes are that are returning back. But after the northern kingdom was dispersed, there was no biblical precedent to continue to keep the Jubilee. And so their reasoning from this is in Leviticus 25, and it says, sanctify the 50th year and proclaim freedom throughout the land for all who live in it. And they were saying that all who live in it needs to be a representation, at least, of all 12 tribes, and they need to be on their property. And so that's kind of what happened there. So it hasn't been kept, but God, right? He is using everything, and it's a big, beautiful picture of God. So the fulfillment of the Jubilee. The fulfillment of the Jubilee will be the millennial reign of Jesus. You can see this in Scripture very, very clearly, that everything that the Jubilee is looking toward, and everything that it is a shadow and a type of, will not happen until the millennial reign of Christ. And so that will be the fulfillment. And Jesus has partially fulfilled it. And we're going to look at that in just a minute, but he partially fulfilled it when he returns to set up his kingdom, reclaiming the land of Israel as its original owner, and releasing all debts, releasing all prisoners, releasing people completely from sin and evil and all of that. And so that will all be when he comes back, and he sets up, and he's not only coming back as the original owner of Israel, but of the planet, of everything, because all creation was made through Jesus, and nothing was created outside of Jesus. And so he's coming back with that, the scroll that's in his hand, that deed to earth that he has come, opening up the seals to that deed. So Colossians tells us, and you who were dead in your trespasses and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, with Jesus, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt. That's Jubilee talk. By canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. Thus, he set aside nailing to the cross. And so on the cross, he canceled the record of our debt. That's very Jubilee talk, canceling the debts, freeing us. And so partially that has been fulfilled, and we're still awaiting the final of that, the year of Jubilee. So Jubilee is the year of the Lord's favor, and we read about it here in the book of Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant those who mourn in Zion, to give them beautiful headdresses instead of ashes. And I want you guys to notice this right here, okay? So the first part, and we're going to see this in just a minute when Jesus reads it, but the first part, to proclaim the Lord's favor, that is what Jesus did then. Now we're actually looking at the millennial reign, to comfort all who mourn, to grant those who mourn in Zion. That'll be the millennial reign. To give them beautiful headdresses instead of ashes. That just makes me think of just all the horrible things that the nation of Israel has had to go through for Holocaust, and ever since, they have been, the enemy has constantly been trying to destroy them. The oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint spirit, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. They shall build up the ancient ruins. And you see that you see that that has been happening since 1948, building up those ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. Strangers shall stand and tend your flocks. Foreigners shall be your plowmen and vine dressers. But you shall be called the priest of the Lord. See, one day Israel will be restored to what God had meant it for it to be, a nation of priests. They shall speak of you as the ministers of our God. You shall eat the wealth of the nations, and in their glory you shall boast. Instead of your shame, they shall be a double portion. Instead of dishonor, they shall rejoice in their lot. Therefore, in their land, they shall possess a double portion. They shall have everlasting joy. And see that double portion also, that's gleaned and that's harvested before the Jubilee. So you have the double portion going into the Jubilee. And so we see here Isaiah speaking of the Jubilee, speaking of the millennial reign of Christ. That's something that can only happen when Jesus is reigning. And so we see here Jesus, it was his custom to go into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he would read from the Torah portion. So he was reading from the portion that they would read that day, and everything is organized. They go through every year. They go through portions to where they're reading the entire Tanakh in a year. And so when he went, it opened up to Isaiah 61, what we just read. But this is what he read. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And he closed the book. And he gave it again to the minister, and he sat down. And the eyes of all of them that were on the synagogue were fastened on him. Luke 4:18-20. Did you catch where he stopped? He stopped right before. He said to preach the acceptable day of the Lord. He stopped before the wrath of God. And then the millennial reign. Because he knew that was going to be kept when he came back the second time. What he came to do this first time was to heal the brokenhearted, deliver the captives. He came the first time as the suffering servant, but when he comes the second time, he's going to come back to set up his kingdom. And so it wasn't time for the judgment yet. It was the acceptable year of the Lord when the Lord actually came in person. And so he stopped short of the day of vengeance of our God. That will be during the tribulation. So God told Moses, so we're going to go to the Jubilees here. So we've looked here that we know the fulfillment of the Jubilee is going to be the millennial reign of Christ. That's what it's going toward. It's all about the land going back to its original owner. So 120. This is very interesting because we are right on the cuffs of 120 Jubilees. Why does that matter? Since Adam, why does that matter? Well, we're going to look at in the days of Noah, because Jesus said it'll be like the days of Noah. It'll be like the days of Lot. It'll be like the days of Noah. And I think there's more to that than we may even realize. And so God told Moses man's days would be 120 years. He told that to Moses. And we're going to read the context of when he said that, because he was not talking about man will live 120 years. This was punishment. This was judgment. And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to the men, that the sons of God, those are the angels, saw the daughters of men that were fair, and they took them as wives of all that they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. And so God said, I'm giving them 120 years. So there were giants on the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. The same mighty men were of old, men of renown. And God saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every imagination of their thoughts and their heart was evil continually. So the enemy had taken over mankind. You know, Satan had continued to meddle in God's creation. And so here, his fallen angels were seducing women. They were having children. And so you have these Nephilim, you have these giants, you have these hybrids between angels, fallen angels, and men. And so God said, I'm giving it 120 years. And that's when he brought in Noah, who was perfect in his generations. And he had Noah build the ark. And it was just Noah and his 8 that survived. The flood, of course, that happened at that 120 years. So what does this have to do with Jubilees? We are about to look at 120. You see, God limited man's years back in Genesis. You know, God said that there'll be 2 destructions. The destruction by water, the flood. And then the next destruction, he said he's never going to destroy the earth by water again. It'll be by fire. And so there's the water, and now we're looking at the fire, which will be the end. You know, God will be by fire. And so Jesus said it'll be like the days of Noah leading up to that. So here you see God limited man's years. He didn't limit the generation of men to 120 years. Moses even said in Psalm 90:10 that a generation is 70 to 80 years. God gave man 120 years before the flood would come. He gave them exactly how long they had to clean up their act before it was going to be over. And of course, nobody cared. Nobody paid attention to Noah preaching, to Noah trying to warn, to the ark being built and these animals miraculously coming, and no one paid any attention. So 120 was the end. That was the judgment day. Jesus says when he returns, it'll be like the days of Noah. So it'll be like that, to where people, even though the judgment's there, even though God's been clear, even though God's been giving all the signs, the majority of the people won't see it, just like they didn't see it in his days. So there have been nearly 120 Jubilees from Adam until right now. And so the first Jubilee happened during Adam's days. The third one was when Seth was born, or he was born in the third Jubilee. The eighth Jubilee, Noah was born. The 50th Jubilee was when Israel entered into the promised land. And this is really, really interesting because God had the timing perfect. If Israel would have entered into the promised land 40 years earlier, which is where they should have if they hadn't disobeyed, then they wouldn't have been entered in on the 50th Jubilee. But they entered in the 50th Jubilee. See, God knew, just like Jesus is the lamb slain before the foundation of the world, God knew what man would do. He knew that Jesus would have to be the sacrifice, and he did it anyway. God knew Israel would mess up and would have to wander around the desert for 40 years, a year for every day the spies went that gave the evil report. He knew, and it was all factored into his plan. And so on the 50th Jubilee, the nation of Israel goes into the promised land. On the 80th Jubilee, Jesus died on the cross. So it was that Jubilee year when Jesus said, this is the acceptable day. This is the acceptable year of the Lord. The favor of the Lord. That was the 80th Jubilee. And that says a lot too, because 80, Moses was 80 when he delivered the Israelites out of Egypt. There's a lot of 80s. And so that's interesting too, that it was that 80th Jubilee that Jesus came and freed the people. And so from Adam to Jesus is 4,000 years. So that's 80 Jubilees. And Jesus sets the captives free. Trying to figure out the exact date of his crucifixion can be a little bit tricky because people have all different kinds of dates. But I do think that there's some very good arguments that it was 28 AD. It was with the way the stars were aligning, the days of the week, just the way everything was falling. It makes a lot of sense that it would have been 28 AD. And so both C.J. Lovett and this name that I can't pronounce, they do a really good job of kind of explaining that. And I think it makes a lot of sense. But so this is very interesting. So if that was 28 AD, it's anywhere from 27 AD to 30 or 33 AD is the understanding of probably when that happened. So due to Israel's unbelief, remember, it was because of the evil report that they had to wander around in the desert for 40 years. Okay? So it's because of their unbelief that they had to wander around the desert for 40 years to be brought into their promised land on the 50th Jubilee. So it was Joshua, which in Hebrew is the same name as our Lord, the same name, Yeshua. Joshua's name and Jesus's name, Yeshua, is the same name. So it was Joshua, Yeshua, that brought Israel into the promised land there on the 50th Jubilee. So Israel, due to their unbelief, they rejected Jesus. They rejected their Messiah. Here, Israel's unbelief, they rejected the promised land. They were afraid. They rejected the promised land. They had to wander around for 40 years. Israel rejected Jesus. And they have been in a judgment for 40 Jubilees. 40 years they were wandering around in the desert because they didn't go into the promised land. For 40 Jubilees, they've been scattered to the four corners. Just now, since 1948, have they been regathering back into their land and being restored. But 40 Jubilees, they were scattered to the four corners of the earth, and they're going to be brought back into the millennial reign by Jesus, by Yeshua. He will, just like Joshua brought them back in after their 40 years of judgment. It will be Jesus, after their 40 Jubilees of judgment, that will bring them into the promised land on the last Jubilee, the 120th Jubilee. And so that's very interesting, just to see how I had never caught that before, but it's been 40 Jubilees since they rejected Jesus. And it was 40 years in the wilderness. I just think that's fascinating. So here we see from Hebrews, so then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works, as God did from his. And so there remains this Sabbath rest, and we can enter that rest in Jesus. His yoke is easy, but there's also there's much more here, because we're not going to completely be in a Sabbath rest until we're in his presence. And that, of course, is true for Israel as well. So the 120th Jubilee, this is the end of man's days, or the end of man's 6,000 years. So we look at man has 6,000 years. The 7,000 year is the millennial reign of Christ. Man has 6 days to work. The seventh day is rest. Man has 6,000 years to work. The 7,000 years, the millennial reign of Christ. So 6,000 divided by 50 is 120 Jubilees. So there are 120 Jubilees before the millennial reign begins. So the 120th Jubilee, this is the end of man's days and the end of man's 6,000 years of work, entering into the millennial reign of Jesus. So depending on when Jesus was crucified, we are very close to only 7 years, or one Shemitah cycle, away from the 120th Jubilee year. So the last week of Daniel's 70 weeks is the Shemitah cycle. And so it's very interesting. Everything that he's doing has specific purpose. And so there's one Shemitah cycle left to the nation of Israel. And, if you look at Daniel's 70 weeks, Jesus fulfilled it all the way up through the 69th week. And because they rejected him, there have been, instead of 40 years of wandering, there's been 40 Jubilees of wandering before they will be able to come into the promised land, which is really the Jubilee, really the millennial reign of Christ. And so there's that one Shemitah cycle left before the end. And so what does this have to do with harvest season? Because I do think this is important for us, because there's so much about harvesting in God's word, harvesting of people, harvesting of souls. And there's a lot of lessons there that he gives in the way that we grow in him, the way that the harvest, the early and latter rains, the way that they come, the way that the wheat and the tares will grow together. All those things are pictures that we can glean a lot from. But God works in patterns, and he's got the yearly pattern to teach us his redemptive plan. So the 7 feasts of the Lord, that is a yearly dress rehearsal, a yearly reminder to us and to the nation of Israel, of course, God's redemptive plan, from Jesus's first coming at Passover to the Holy Spirit coming. And now we're looking to the fall feast for his second coming. So this all relates to the harvest season. Passover is the barley harvest. That's the easiest harvest. That's where that's the easiest one to harvest. Pentecost is the wheat harvest, which has to be kind of crushed more and beaten. Then Tabernacles is the grape harvest. It's the fruit, the olive oil, the wine harvest. All that is happening toward end of summer, early fall. There's much to glean here, but simply put, God is tying the salvation of souls to harvest types and shadows. So these sabbatical cycles, they have the same pattern of preparation before the Sabbath. And so there's this rule here of preparing before the Sabbath, because you don't work on the Sabbath. You have to work while it's light, because when it's night, you can't work, right? So you have to do the work while it's allowed to do it, because there'll come a day when there's no more harvesting. And so that's a practical word, but for us as Christians, we have to go out and share God now, because there will be a day when that door opens for us, and it'll be the most joyous day ever, because we get to see Jesus face to face, and we'll be with him, face to face forever. But the very day that the door opens for us, the door is shutting for others, and they'll be in darkness. They'll be in the tribulation, and there's still hope for salvation during that. They'll be the greatest revival ever will come out of the tribulation. The Bible is very clear that the greatest revival, and a number that can't even be counted, will come out of the Great Tribulation. But we don't want anyone to have to go through that to get saved. And so for us, we need to be out there harvesting while we still can. So the weekly Sabbath, this cycle of preparing. So the weekly Sabbath is that Friday is the preparation day. That sixth day, you harvest. That sixth day, you do everything that you're supposed to do, so you don't have to worry about it on Sabbath. Any cooking that needs to be done, you do. Any cleaning that needs to be done, you do it then, because you're not going to do it on Sabbath. So, and you remember in the wilderness, Israel collected the double manna, because no manna would fall on Sabbath. So then that brings us to the 6th year of a yearly Shemitah cycle. So the 6th year was the preparation year. They had to make sure that they harvested. They had to make sure that they allotted the time and thought about it to make sure that they harvested enough, and they thought ahead to prepare for what that sabbatical year was going to look like. And they were trusting God for a double portion to make up for that. And so then the Jubilee cycle, the last yearly cycle, again, that lasts to 6th year, but even more so, they would make sure that they were thinking about it ahead of time, ahead even of cycles, not just that 6th year, because they realize that there's going to be 2 years. And there's a lot that goes into the Jubilees. There was extra preparation and extra, because they really had to make sure that they had prepared enough. And so that reminded me of, in Joseph, God gave him the understanding of the dream, of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, that it was 7 healthy cows would be those 7 years of plenty, those 7 years where you got to set aside during those 7 years, because when the 7 years of famine came, they would be so intense that they would completely eat up everything that was healthy. And so that's interesting, because 7 years ago, God gave a warning sign. There was a lot of warning signs in 2014, 2015. That's when the blood moon cycles were coming. There was a lot going on in the sun, the moon, and the stars. And there was a lot going on prophetically. A lot of big new age and even laws in nations were being made that you could see the turn was going toward the things of the enemy rather than the things of God. But I remember the cows. Do you guys remember the 2 cows with sevens on their head. And this was very interesting because it was right around Rosh Hashanah in 2014, where there were these two cows. And so the first cow was the black and white cow with the real pretty big seven. And then the next cow was the brown cow with the little kind of, not as pretty seven. And there was a lot of talk about, well, this reminds us of Joseph and the healthy cows and the sickly cows. And that was really interesting, and then everybody forgot about it. But now in 2021, when we see really the last 7 years, there were a lot of wake-up calls. There were a lot of big signs from God where he said, okay, now is the time to get to harvesting, Christians. Now is the time to wake up, because there's going to come a time when the door's going to be closed. And so it's very interesting that was 7 years ago, the two cows, to where we could very well be going into the 7 years of famine. Very well could be going into the 7 years of tribulation very, very soon. And these past 7 years have been the time for harvest, been the time for going out and trying to bring in the last of the harvest, wake up and get people in. So it makes sense that the harvest of souls would come before the Sabbath, before the Jubilee year, because you can't harvest on a Sabbath year. You can't harvest on a Shemitah year. So it makes sense, if God is going by these types and shadows, that the rapture of the church would happen before a Shemitah started. Makes sense that it would. Not saying that it will, because I don't know the day or the hour, but it's very interesting because it doesn't really fit his types and shadows that the rapture would happen during a Shemitah, because the harvest is supposed to happen before the Shemitah starts. So the rapture will start prior to a yearly Shemitah cycle, and then the tribulation is, of course, 7 years. So it makes sense that the rapture would happen in the end of that 6th year, and then, of course, the tribulation is a 7-year cycle. The double portion harvesting prior, and I wonder if that could be that the dead in Christ rise first, and then those of us who are alive and remain are caught up to meet them, and we have a double portion. So Jesus separates the sheep from the goats at his return. So there's a 7-year Shemitah cycle of the tribulation period. When Jesus returns, he separates the sheep from the goats, and he harvests those that belong to him. And so here we see it would be Rosh Hashanah that he would be returning as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and he would be separating them out. And then Yom Kippur is when the Jubilee is announced. Yom Kippur is when the shofar is blown for the Jubilee. And that is when that Jubilee part, that release happens, that the deed goes back, the land goes back to its original owner, and the earth goes back to its original owner, and then going into the fulfillment of the Jubilee after the tribulation as that 7th Shemitah cycle. So what does this have to do with us? What does that have to do with Christians? What part of this has to do with Christians? What part of this has to do with Israel? When it comes to Jubilee, when it comes to Shemitah, we can glean from it, because we can glean from everything about God, because we love him and we want to know his character and we want to know everything about him. But these signs are specifically to the children of Israel. And sometimes people like to try to, put them on things where they don't really belong. They can be used in many different ways, but God's ultimate purpose for Shemitahs, his ultimate purpose for Jubilee especially, is the nation of Israel. These are signs to them. Remember his own words. I gave them my Sabbaths as a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. See, we, the church, are going to be raptured before the tribulation happens. The tribulation, the purpose of the tribulation is for the salvation of the Hebrew nation, salvation of the Jews. It's not for us, it's for them. It's the time of Jacob's trouble. It's Jacob's final week, Daniel's final week, but that belongs to Israel for the redemption and the finishing of Israel. So Sabbaths are given to Israel as a sign between her and God. They pertain to the land of Israel. We can learn from them about his character, about what his plan is, but they're meant as a sign to the Hebrew people. So the fulfillment will have everything to do with Israel. A Jubilee has got to line up with Israel. It's got to line up with Israel, and it's got to line up with Jesus, with something that Jesus is doing. Definitely his return would be that Jubilee. So the fulfillment will have everything to do with Israel. The book of Revelation is written from Israel as the center of everything. It's written from that everything is around the geography of Israel. And the same is true for every end time prophecy. It's made from that perspective of what's happening to Israel. So what does this have to do with us? It has so much to do with us because we're so blessed to be the bride of Christ. So when Jesus comes back to begin the Jubilee, we come back with him, which is so awesome. So we're going to be caught up. We're going to be harvested. We're going to be freed. And we will be with him during those 7 Shemitah years, during those 7 years of the last Shemitah cycle. So when Christ, who is our life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. So when Jesus appears, when he comes back on that white horse, we are coming back with him. We're the multitude, we're the myriads coming back with him. As Jude 14 says, it was about these people, us, that Enoch in the 7th generation from Adam prophesied when he said, look, the Lord came with myriads of his holy ones. And myriads means like 10,000s of 10,000s, a number that are really big numbers, what myriad means. And so we come back with him. And so we have so much to look forward to. And because we are the bride of the King and we come back with him.